Welcome to the Upstream conference. My name is John Mark Welker. I'm from Fannie Mae. I run our open source program office, and I'm going to talk to you today about what's in it for me, the enlightened self-interest of contributing upstream. Since this is the Upstream conference, we're going to be talking about what does it take to go upstream. Now, I'm coming from the background of someone who's been in open source circles for a long time. For the last few years, I've been in some highly regulated, low-risk environments. And I'm going to walk through why it's in everyone's interest to contribute to upstream, what you get from it, and why it's frankly self-defeating not to be upstream. One of the central questions I've asked myself over the last few years is why so few companies outside of the usual software space are visible or participating in our upstream open source communities. And so I've delved into that. I think I can answer that question, and I think I can provide some prescriptive steps that you can take so that your company can also venture into the great wilds of the open source communities. So stay tuned, and we're going to go through that. Let's talk about what it means to be upstream. One of the, I guess over the last 2 years, I picked up a book from Dan Heath called Upstream, which doesn't refer to software per se, but it does refer to upstream in the sense of how to address problems proactively at their source, as opposed to waiting for the problems to come down to you and then reacting to them and dealing with them when they hit you. One of the examples from the book is pretty funny because it's literally talking about pollution in a river and the pollution drifting downstream and constantly trying to clean it. And then at some point they have an aha moment and they say, oh, let's go upstream and deal with the problem at the source. Now, not all issues or challenges or problems are that straightforward or simple, but it kind of illustrates the centrality of the problem, because you would think that it's fairly simple and easy to come to the conclusion that, well, we should deal with these problems upstream at their source rather than having to constantly fight the battle as they flow downstream. But that's one of the issues that we have to resolve as humans. Things that humans don't do well include looking into the future beyond the 6-month time horizon, and also thinking about proactively dealing with the problems as opposed to always dealing with the problems as they come downstream. And Dan Heath has a great description of his book. I recommend it. It's a nice. It's categorized as a business book, but frankly, it's just a good descriptor of like how we approach problem solving in general. So there you go. And I figured it'd be good to describe what we mean by upstream before I talk about ways that you can tackle open source problems upstream. So one of the things that I want to address here, when I came up with the concept of this talk, I wanted to talk about, how we're addressing, open source contributions. When we talk about contributing, we're talking about upstream in the communities from where the software originates. And there's an issue where, or I guess one of the ways that this is often described is as some kind of charitable act. You'll see it in the language that companies use when they start talking about putting a project into an open source community. They talk about donating the project or donating the code as if it were some kind of grand gesture. What I want to talk about is how it's not a public good or grand philanthropic gesture. It's really about just making things work together better, and how we should all contribute to that overall process. But I think it's actually kind of dangerous to think of it as a charitable act, because it puts our state of mind in the wrong place. When we're contributing code, it's not philanthropy, it's not charity. We're just wanting to make things work better. If we think of it as charitable, then it becomes this thing that we do off to the side that's not core to what we do. It's something that during economic downturns gets cut because, hey, charity begins at home. It's not something that, if it's charity, then it's not core to our bottom line. what I want to argue here, and I want to make sure everyone understands, is that it is core to your bottom line. Your business will function better if you're able to unlock your contribution process and do it the right way. And that's the whole thrust of this presentation, is why everyone should take this approach and not think of it in terms of, you know, a nice to have. It's core. It's the thing that you should be doing because you're going to notice improvements because of it. And we're going to walk through what some of those improvements are. So let's think about what we can learn from, you know, open source process and open source organization, open source communities. Because when you think about how open source has progressed over the years, you know, we didn't set out to create this massively innovative ecosystem. We had much more pressing problems and challenges to resolve when we started building these open source communities. We had to figure out, how do we actually allow people from around the world to produce things collectively and collaboratively in such a way that could be, you know, actually useful. And before the internet, these things happened very manually. But with the advancement of internet-based technologies like the World Wide Web, it became easier to facilitate these sorts of things. And so as different developers around the world start to figure out the mechanics of how this works, we ended up producing these centers of innovation that produced these massive ecosystems that now power the entire world. It's pretty phenomenal when you think about what we as open source developers have been able to create over the last 25 years or 30 years, whenever you want to push the start date to. But there was a significant difference in how we designed these communities to work versus how software was produced previously. And when you want to look at the differences between those methodologies, and then maybe you can perhaps study them and think about how innovation happened, or how we set the stage for innovation. Because like I said, we didn't set out to produce the innovation. It was just a happy byproduct of doing the right thing. If you look at how software was made prior to open source practices or methodologies, it was very much one-way driven. You had a vendor that produced software and they pushed it down to users or various partners, and that's how software was made. And maybe there was some feedback session where, you know, people filed tickets or made product requests or that sort of thing, but it was all firmly in the hands of the vendor, and you had to wait for it to happen to be pushed down to you. Whereas when you look at how open source communities function, I think one of the key insights that I had when I was looking at how communities function versus how vendor and customers relationships function, one of the key pieces to that I can see is, in an open source community project, everyone has a seat at the table. Whether you're one of the core team members, or whether you're one of the organizations that is, what a reason, has invested in this area of technology, or whether you're just a drive-by contributor or someone that writes documentation or some other contribution, or you're an end user that uses the products and participates in some way, you all have a seat at the table. And there is certainly a hierarchy to how, you know, communities operate, but everything is transparent. You're not denying someone entry just because they're an end user or because they're a contributor or some other part of the community, at least in well-functioning communities, let's be clear. It's important that in these communities, you've designed a process where everyone has a seat at the table and can contribute in some way. And that's the key insight that I want everyone to understand, is that in this place, an open source community, everyone sort of understands the rules. Everyone understands where to go, how to do stuff, how things get done, and everyone can plug in to where they're supposed to be in order to make the community function. Everyone has a role to play, and it's all clearly laid out. Again, in well-functioning, highly functioning communities, this is how it goes. As opposed to the old model where you had a set of people who did the stuff and they pushed down one way and users used. In the open source model, any of these little bubbles you see here, whether end user or committer or contributor, you can switch places. You can go to an organization and become the organizational liaison, or you can become a single contributor. There's sort of like there's a blurring of the lines. While there is a hierarchy of user and developer, those things change over time and they can be very fluid. And the goal of a community is to account for this fluidity and allow people to change over time. And it becomes this organism in its own right that takes on its own identity. And that's sort of a beautiful thing to watch unfold when it works right. One of my favorite case studies is from, it was commissioned by the World Bank. The World Bank was investing some time and effort and money, I think, into this project called GeoNode. I think GeoNode was basically, or is still, a project that helps to direct resources to emergency hotspot areas in the world so that you can get, so that aid can be delivered to the areas where it's needed. So they invested some time and money into this project, and they thought, well, this has turned out pretty well. We think it's been good for us. In 2017, the World Bank commissioned a study from Carl Fogel and his consultants. James Vasile was another guy as part of this study. And they asked them if they could quantify the value that they got from investing in this project. And the results were pretty interesting because there are some top line and kind of like top line numbers and kind of like second tier numbers. And I actually find the second tier numbers more interesting, but the headline stat was, if you invest $1 into a collaborative project, then you get $2 of value in return. That's pretty cool, right? Okay, you double your investment. Awesome. What they found was that by following certain practices, you would kind of maximize the benefit that you got from collaboration. And when they went into further detail, this is where I talk about the kind of second tier of numbers. It's not so much that you got 2x the benefit. What was interesting to me was that when they really dove into the numbers, what they found was that not only did you get 2x benefit, but it was the way that you invested your resources that helped to determine how much benefit you got. When you looked at the total amount of investments, less than 60%, I think 57% was pure engineering. It was just code. But beyond that, about 43% was kind of non-code community activities, whether it was documentation or what you call marketing or outreach, community management, events, all those sorts of things that help to round out the community. That made the difference in how much value was added through collaboration. It became a multiplier effect, and it's a great case study to show us why whenever we invest in collaboration, if you're just adding a bunch of engineers to it, you're not necessarily getting the full benefit. You have to think about a community holistically, and you have to think about what it means to be part of that community and where the resources should be applied and what kind of people need to fill those roles. So it's an excellent case study. Hopefully I can add a link to it so that you can look it up. Which brings me to the source code and contributing source code and why you don't see more companies contributing to open source projects. Because here's the thing, we have data that shows us that collaboration is very lucrative, that collaboration produces real benefits, real results that you can see materialize over time. So the question that has bugged me and kind of been in the back of my mind for 10 years now is, if collaboration in open source communities is so beneficial, why don't we see more companies doing it? And this question has really driven me for, again, the last 10 years. It's one of the things where I really want to understand what it is that prevents companies from fully participating and kind of getting the maximum benefit from these open source projects and communities. Because look, we have the data. We know that this works. So why aren't more companies there? And when I say more companies, I mean beyond core IT. I mean, software companies are there, right? The Googles, the Microsofts, the Red Hats. It's baked into their business model. They know that these communities are core to their mission, and so they do it. But for a non-IT company, it's less clear, or at least it has been. And so what I'm really kind of directing this talk to them, because they're the ones that we need to win their hearts and minds and bring them across the line so that they can be more participatory. And so one of the things that has, as I sort of dove into the question of why more companies don't participate, one thing has started to emerge, which is around, information security and things like risk. And when you talk to kind of the non-tech, non-IT companies, the points about security become more front and center. It becomes one of those things that prevent these companies from participating, because there's been a lot of scary stuff that's been published about open source. And indeed, if you look at who has been the most successful in selling products into these companies, it's the companies that make, say, scanning tools that will now show you the thousands of vulnerabilities that pervade your software architecture and your internal ecosystem. We've heard a lot of talk, especially with Log4j, recently about supply chain security and about software bills and materials, or SBOMs, and how you need to have a strategy around this stuff. And so if you look at the conversations that have been taking place around open source ecosystems, especially in the last 5 years, really since Equifax, it's been a pretty scary mess, because the message that's been received by CIOs at non-tech companies is open source is scary. And so what I want to do is help counteract that a little bit and kind of explain how to participate in these open source communities without exposing yourself to a bunch of security risk. Because actually one of the things that's come out of my discussions with our Gartner analysts is that Gartner has told us very bluntly, open source is actually more secure because it's transparent. You know what's in it. Whereas, even though the White House issued a directive over a year ago that companies need to disclose their SBOMs, it's still not happening as a regular practice. And so a lot of these proprietary tools and software builds, we still don't know what all the open source components are. We still don't know what the bill of materials is. And so it's still a challenge to get that full disclosure. And so the Gartner analyst told us very upfront, hey, look, the reason you know about Log4j is because you have it. You're able to look at it as it's being pulled into your build process. And so it's that transparency. It gives us that visibility that helps us to be more secure and design more secure processes and have more secure coding practices. And when you talk about supply chain security, most tech and IT companies, they know how to address the security risk. They know how to put in processes that help to mitigate that. Whereas a non-tech company, a non-IT company, non-software company, they'll look at the same thing and they'll get a different message because they're not from that kind of software culture. And so it's not core to what they do. And so they will receive the same message in a different way. And so I think we as open source professionals need to be mindful of this and think about how we are discussing supply chain risk, supply chain security, SBOMs. And we need to understand that it gets received differently depending on what kind of company culture you're coming from. It's not just about the source code. In fact, the source, and as I mentioned before with the World Bank study, source code is just one part of it. I mean, it's an important part, don't get me wrong, but there's a whole lot that goes around it when you're talking about software and how to fix bugs or how to mitigate risk or repair vulnerabilities. First of all, there's a process that goes into it. There's a way that you facilitate human interaction that goes into it. You have to think about how you set up governance so that people understand where they fit in various communities that you're building. And you have to think about the documentation, the outreach, who do you have that's going to connect the engineers that need to work together? How do they work together? It becomes this massive problem that And a lot of companies didn't really manifest itself in the same way because you had, again, these very siloed operations. You had different teams, they all did their jobs, and they kind of produced their thing, and they kind of did it, independently. But what we're talking about is, when we talk about making our teams force multipliers, and we talk about making it easier to collaborate, you got to think about contribution models, governance, pathways to communication, pathways to collaboration, and think about how it all kind of adds up. Again, so we get the 1 and 1 makes 3 scenario that we talked about. And so when you think about it in these terms, you think about how it's not just source code, and that we have to figure out a way to engage in a collaborative way, and how we need to enable contributions, it becomes clear how the obstacles that we insert to prevent that from happening. And if you look at, say, a company, organization that wants to make that change, they want to graduate from the lower left to the top right, and how they do that, it's very common for these types of companies, especially if you're in a highly regulated environment. It becomes very easy to see why they don't participate. And I mentioned that one of the driving questions I wanted to answer was, why don't you see more companies participating upstream? Well, this is why. And once you understand kind of like the full gamut of things that are closed off to so many people, you really begin to understand why it's so difficult to pull in these companies as participants in these open source communities. And so you have to think about how do you overcome these obstacles so that these companies and their employees can become not just participants, but influential in these communities and actually help to drive their process and drive their direction. Because ultimately, we do want non-tech, non-IT companies to be present. Having a diversity of opinions is a good thing, and having people that come from different backgrounds is a good thing. It adds to the collaborative culture and helps us all be better. And this is why we need to understand what the impediments are and how to overcome them. I always plug the idea that you need to be very friendly with your legal, your risk managers, your other people that are ever present in your typical large corporation, especially in highly regulated ones. And you need to think about, what it is that they want to see. And I have had pretty good success working with all of these groups to help us improve our open source contribution processes. It's not that they're against it, it's that they've been directed not to expose their employers to unneeded risk. And the way I've been able to work with them is to explain, here is how you can do it in a way that will benefit everyone. And you can also do it in such a way that you're limiting your exposure and not providing needless access. It's really setting about and identifying, here are the things that you need. Here are the core people that are going to be involved, and that can grow over time, but you start with a small number and you say, look, we can monitor this pretty easily. We have the people in place. We know who's doing it. Let's create a system of record so that we can start to drive this cultural change that we will all benefit from. And I think once they all understand that there's this benefit that comes from working with you and driving this activity, it's a much easier sell. And I highly recommend that you work hand in hand with these groups and not think of them as your enemy. Think of them as your partners, because they are. So when you look at that from that angle, and you think about how to unlock contribution model, especially in terms of, and I mean an external contribution model, you have to look at, you got to start somewhere. And so what I think that the path you usually want to take is, where are your biggest technology dependencies? What are the software ecosystems that you're most dependent on? Where are the places where you're the most invested? And where are you going to get the biggest benefit from starting to contribute? And so once you understand like where you're invested and what the technologies are, it becomes a lot more clear where to put your time into unlocking the contributions and which group to start with when you want to enable their contributions. But then you have to think about, from a process standpoint, again, you've been working with legal and risk and your other corporate governance, and you've had to think about what's the process. If we're going to enable this kind of activity, how do we do it in a risk managed way? And so that comes down to understanding how to get from point A to B. You're starting with your source code or some other contribution, and you want to end up in this community. Well, what's the pathway you need to take in order, and what are the steps you need to unlock in order for it to become reality? And that's where that's where the process management comes into play. That's where process engineers come in handy, someone that can actually design a workflow or flow chart that shows you how to push the data in a way such that you're not going to accidentally disclose things that are going to embarrass you, or that things that are non-public information. And once you have those steps in place, you have a system of record that shows, here's the data, here's what it is. We have a way to make sure that it's not confidential. And then we can have this pathway that opens up to the external world. Once you have that process in place, it's really just a matter of putting it in motion. I mean, that's when you think about who needs access and where. And one of the ways that you talk to your information security people is by making sure that there is accountability, and there are people who have access and people who don't. And the people who have access understand the responsibility of having that access. So I've been talking a lot about collaboration and contribution and why it's good and why it's part of the maturation process as you go from a user to a leader in a given field. And you may be thinking, well, okay, that sounds great, but what have you been doing? Because you may not have seen Fannie Mae in a lot of open source places. Well, here's the thing. I joined Fannie Mae in April of last year, and I came here with the express purpose of building an open source program and helping us, chase that gap between user and leader. And as part of this talk and as part of this conference, I am very pleased to announce that we're going to be releasing our first contributing our first open source code in a way that I think was going to be helpful to the folks that in other organizations that are in a similar place to us in terms of the challenges they face. Because we looked at the things that the challenges that we have, the biggest challenges that we have. And without going into too much detail, it comes down to, there are dependencies in our software builds where they have no upgrade path, but for whatever reason, they come out of our scanning tools and they're labeled as high risk or critical risk, critical vulnerabilities. And again, there's no upgrade because there is disagreement between the originating communities about whether or not it's a vulnerability, and our developers end up stuck because we don't want them using code with a critical vulnerability. So what we've decided to do is we're going to take the ones with no upgrade path, things like Spring Web, things like Pandas, places where we've invested a lot of time and effort, and we have a density of engineers who are relatively proficient in how these things work. And they're going to be cleaning them, removing the pieces that make them vulnerable, and then pushing them into an external repository. Now, I don't know if the changes we make are going to be acceptable to the originating communities from which they come, but we can, at the very least, make them available so that other companies that are faced with the same challenges that we have, because I know that a lot of companies depend on these libraries. A lot of companies, they probably have SCA scanners, just like we do, that label them as higher critical vulnerabilities. And there are probably information security groups within these companies, just like we have, that are saying, we don't want you using code with critical vulnerabilities. So in order to alleviate this problem, we're going to start here. We're going to make them available. And so we're going to put it into, I have the link here. We're going to put it into our GitHub organization space where we're going to have a project called the Clean Dependency Project. Now, if others want to contribute their libraries to this, great, we're going to figure that out. We're going to understand, but first of all, we just want to make this stuff available so we can get it out there. And then we're going to do that so in a way that it becomes visible for everyone else. This is where we're going. This is going to be our first project. We're hoping to make the first ones available for public distribution within the next few weeks. So watch this space. We're going to have some fun stuff here. And that's it. Thank you so much for your time. Looking forward to all the other great talks and looking forward to talking to you and answering any questions. Thank you.